Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, a triumphant President Trump delivers a 100-minute-long address to Congress, his first since taking office 6 weeks ago, in which he declares that America is back. Well, in that address, President Trump said he'd received a letter from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, in which he said he was ready to come to the negotiating table. And Palestinians cautiously welcome the outcome of Tuesday's Arab Leaders Summit in Cairo, which endorsed an Egyptian plan to rebuild Gaza without transferring its population. Hello and welcome to the program. We begin with the latest from President Donald Trump's address to a joint session of the US Congress last night. This was his first such address since he returned to power, and he used the opportunity to declare that, quote, "The American dream is unstoppable." Well, in this, the longest presidential speech to lawmakers on record, he used the 100 minutes to outline his vision for a second term. Well, President Trump said that one of his top priorities was going to be to rescue the economy. And on that note, he pledged to organize the federal government to lower costs. Well, since taking office on the 20th of January, Trump has slashed the federal workforce and cracked down on immigration, whilst imposing tariffs on some of America's biggest trade partners. Well, let's take a listen now to some of the highlights from that address.
America is back. Since taking office, my administration has launched the most sweeping border and immigration crackdown in American history, and we quickly achieved the lowest numbers of illegal border crossers ever recorded. Thank you. To further combat inflation, we will not only be reducing the cost of energy, but will be ending the flagrant waste of taxpayer dollars. Under the Trump administration, all of these scams, and they're far worse, but I didn't think it was appropriate to talk about them. They're so bad. Many more have been found out and exposed and swiftly terminated by a group of very intelligent, mostly young people, headed up by Elon, and we appreciate it. We found hundreds of billions of dollars of fraud.
President Trump speaking there, well, as he delivered that address, the assembled Democrats gave little applause. Some even walked out, and some held up placards saying things like, quote, "This is a lie." Well, in a rebuttal speech, the Democratic Senator Elisa Stolkin urged U.S. citizens to be alert and to stay engaged in U.S. politics.
He's going to make you pay in every part of your life. Grocery and home prices are going up, not down, and he hasn't laid out a credible plan to deal with either of those. His tariffs on allies like Canada will raise prices on energy, lumber, and cars, and start a trade war that will hurt manufacturing and farmers. Your premiums and prescriptions will cost more because the math on his proposals doesn't work without going after your health care.
Okay, well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Mick Mulvaney, former Chief of Staff to President Trump, who joins us from Washington. Mick, great to have you with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. No pressure, you're opening the program this evening. So let me start by asking you this. If you were to write President Trump's report card for last night, what score would you give him for that 100-minute long speech?
Yeah, Tom, I thought it was a B+ type of speech. First of all, as someone who has to watch the speech for work, I do media here and, of course, overseas with you folks. I had to stay up and watch the whole thing. 2 hours is a really, really long speech. We're hearing some indications this morning that it might be the longest joint address of Congress in history. So that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I prefer less is more type of speeches. I thought he did a decent job of handling the heckling early on. I thought he did a good job of addressing the domestic issues. If I had one criticism of the speech, I thought it was short on foreign policy. Foreign policy, by the way, that's not unusual. Ordinarily, American voters don't care that much. American public doesn't follow foreign policy that closely. It's just a virtue of our history and our geography. But that being said, the meeting with Zelenskyy last week in the Oval Office was so high profile and so garnered so much media attention that I thought we might get a little bit more detail last night on foreign policy in general and Ukraine in specific. But the reports here are pretty good. The polling is in the overnights, and the approval ratings of the speech across all political spectrums are in the high 60s, low 70s. That's pretty good for any politician in this divided environment in my country.
Okay, so just to recap, you would take off a couple of points because it was too long, and you thought it was a little on the light side with regards to foreign policy, hence the B grade. 6 weeks, I mean, so much has happened. I mean, there's been this whirlwind of activity, sometimes very hard to keep track of it. Do you think perhaps the president's trying to do too much too quickly?
No, I think it's by design. There's a term in sports called flooding the zone, where you just put as many players up towards the goal as you can at one time, and that's what they're doing. Keep in mind, he's in a unique situation in our history of having come back to the White House after spending 4 years away. So his team has had 4 years to think and plan and plot as to what they wanted to do. So what you're seeing is the rush of material that they've been working 4 years on. So no, I don't think they're doing too much. I think they're doing it on purpose, and I think they're going to be able to keep this pace up at least until the summer, and maybe even as far as the entire calendar year.
Let's just talk about the Democrats. I don't know if you watched the rebuttal speech, which presumably came afterwards. In that speech, the Senator Stoltkin referenced to Ronald Reagan and his efforts during the Cold War. I think she said words to the effect she would have rather had President Reagan around during those days than she would have liked to have President Trump had he been on the political scene in those days. I mean, what was she getting at, do you think?
Yeah, look, I know Elise. I like Elise, a very talented, very, very bright lady. And it was a decent speech. Keep in mind, no one's talking about the speech, which means she did a good job. Ordinarily, that is the graveyard of American politicians, that people seem to fail in that response position. There's a long list of politicians whose careers have ended because of that speech, and she didn't fall into that. She did a nice job and gave a basically unremarkable speech. I would give her the same advice about Ronald Reagan as I gave to Mike Pence, who's a good friend of mine, who, when he ran for president this past cycle, would talk about Ronald Reagan all the time. I'm 57 years old, and I was too young to vote for Ronald Reagan. Talking about Ronald Reagan today is like talking about Herbert Hoover in the 1920s. No one knows who he is anymore. So I think it's intellectually very interesting. I think the media pays attention. Folks like me who do this for a living pay attention. But I'm not sure those types of messages land with the folks that you're trying to speak to.
Quite interesting to watch the audience there. I mean, at various points, Republicans got up and gave their approval, their thumbs up to what the president was saying. The Democrats remained seated and hardly clapped at all. Very interesting to see, though, Republicans not standing up in large numbers when the president talked about tariffs. And I'm just wondering if you think that's an indication that perhaps people are a little bit uncomfortable within the party about this particular policy.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that analysis. I think that there's a lot of folks who are nervous about tariffs. Why? Look, what Trump is doing writ large, they're hoping will have a downward pressure on prices, but tariffs taken by themselves are an upward pressure on prices. And politicians of both parties are hearing from voters right now about how expensive things are. And even though tariffs may only increase prices in the short term, before other Trump policies can kick in to lower prices, they're going to raise prices in the short term. And that's a problem politically. Keep in mind, Donald Trump doesn't have to run for office again. In fact, Donald Trump cannot run for office again. And we won't have another presidential election here until 2028. But everybody sitting on that floor in the House of Representatives last night has to run again in about 18 months, which means that election starts in about 12 months, if not less than that. So yeah, there's a lot of people who want to run for re-election who would love to see prices go down, and tariffs are not going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the economic score, there are some complicated questions, some difficult to balance equations. I mean, consumer sentiment surveys showing that people are worried about inflation worsening. You've touched on inflation. These job cuts, we're obviously going to see the unemployment rate, certainly in the DC area and probably in other parts of the country as well, going up. Demand is going to come down for US products with reciprocal tariffs. And then the president wants to balance the federal budget and at the same time enact sweeping tax cuts. I mean, Something here doesn't completely add up, does it?
Oh, no, but it never does in politics. I mean, you show me a politician who knows how to count. I mean, that is the rare thing, and voters don't really count that much. That's how you get $36 trillion in debt. No, look, they're not going to balance the budget. Period. End of story. It's never ever going to happen. I was the budget director for Donald Trump in the first term. The budget I wrote in 2017, which is now 8 years ago, was the last one that showed any pathway towards real balancing. It's not going to happen. So yeah, there's a lot of crosstalk. There's a lot of things that are not reconcilable, which is why, again, go back to your original point, so many of those politicians were sort of slow to cheer tariffs, because that's real. Talk of balancing budgets and so forth, that's sort of pie in the sky. Talk about what the price of eggs is, and Trump did mention that last night. That's absolutely real. I don't worry too much about the job cuts in the government sort of impacting the unemployment rate. I think if they could fire 20,000 people, that's going to be a lot. In a good month in this country, we create about 200,000 new jobs. So that's a small number. That's not going to affect the macroeconomic sort of arc of the country. But the tariffs are real. We import $3.8 trillion worth of goods here every single year. And a 10% tariff is a $380 billion price increase for the American consumer. And that's a real number.
Sure. Well, we'll be talking more about the economy later in the year when, of course, the national debt ceiling has to be raised once again. Otherwise, there'll be a catastrophic default. But let's move on to foreign policy, that little touched on area of the speech that you identified right at the beginning. I mean, world leaders, the whole world would have been watching very closely, listening very closely. Overall, what is the message you think this new administration is sending out to the rest of the world?
I think it's very similar to what it was in the first term. I thought one of the best lines that Donald Trump used in the first term was "America first doesn't mean America alone." Yes, he is looking to reset the relationships with a bunch of different countries and regions. I think it's fair to say he's skeptical about the long-term prospects of our relationship with Europe, that he sees Europe moving in a different direction than he sees America moving. By the way, I put the UK in sort of a middle ground between those two things. The ties between those two countries are so strong that I don't consider, of course, they're not part of Europe, I guess technically anymore, geographically they are, but that you're seeing him review sort of the relationships that we have. Doesn't mean we're going to drop out of NATO. It just means that he's going to look differently at Russia, differently at China, differently at India, differently at our alliances in Asia. I think he thinks now that Australia and Japan are better and more reliable allies right now than, say, France and Germany are. So that is real. It doesn't mean you're going isolationist, and I know that gets pitched that way often overseas, but it means that the relationships will be different. He wants to be much closer to countries in the GCC, I think, than previous administrations do. So it's a different sort of world. It's not a Cold War aligned world anymore, and that is, I wish he had put some more flesh on that bone last night.
Just as we wrap up, Mick, let's look back at these last 6 weeks of the second Trump administration. What stands out for you? What would you say are the most memorable moments? And do you think there's one in there that's a memory for the history books, or is it too soon?
Well, I mean, if you had to, it's so hard to look back 6 weeks when so much happened so quickly, right? I think right now, everybody sort of looks at that Oval Office meeting last Friday with Vladimir Zelenskyy, that will have a place in the history books. But personally, for me, I see this attempt to reform the federal government and reform the power of the executive. Keep in mind, under our system of separation of powers, you have the legislature, you have the executive, you have the judiciary, and there's always a tension between those three. It has been from the very beginning. Donald Trump is talking about not spending money that Congress tells him to spend. The first president who made that argument was Thomas Jefferson in 1800. So this tension is real, but every 100 years or so, it looks like maybe we have a reset on the balance of power between the branches. FDR really was the one who sort of established the social welfare state in this country, and the government as the implementer of that. And is Donald Trump trying to reset that? I know that's sort of esoteric. I know that's very sort of 30,000 feet, but I see that as the general trend of this administration. And I think that's the most interesting thing in the macro that we've seen the first 6 weeks. Although it's hard to take, when you look at the micro level day by day, the Zelenskyy meeting last Friday will be one they talk about for a long time.
I think they probably will. Thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you, Mick Mulvaney. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Sam Nunberg, former advisor to President Trump, who joins us now from Washington as well. Sam, great to have you with us as well. 6 weeks in, the president declaring America is back. Is it a little early to be saying that, do you think?
Well, substantively it isn't, and also he has to do that obviously for political reasons. That speech was masterful last night. When you look at the reviews, I have to tell you personally that when I heard that the speech in advance was going to be over 2 hours or around 2 hours, I rolled my eyes. That famously, for your audience to understand, Bill Clinton gave a State of the Union speech, which was panned as one of the worst speeches ever because he went too long. Now, when we talk about America's success, what he has done and he has been able to do through executive orders and obviously through the power of his presidency and personality is undo immediately failures of Biden, particularly when you look at border enforcement. Illegal immigrants crossings have dramatically dropped to the point that they're the lowest even during his presidency. When you look at what he's been able to do in terms of taking away the red tape, the bureaucracy of government, he has the power through executive orders, and he's been able to cut regulations, particularly on the energy industry. And then going into the culture, and culture is policy, culture is politics now in the United States. He's been able to undo DEI policies across the federal government. And he's also been able to, as I believe it is, respect women in sports by making sure that that males are not able to compete in women's sports. When you look at last night, though, one thing that I was shocked about is normally when any president speaks, you can even look at Biden's State of the Unions and address to Congress, you will have Republicans clapping on certain issues. What I saw last night, I have never seen in terms of the Democrats, particularly a congressman from Texas having to be escorted out. I'm 43 years old. I've been watching these speeches since I'm 5. That has never happened during my lifetime. And you saw that they were really having an open debate and or being raucous against him. What I would say, though, too, is his presidency, and this is one thing that I said in my last interview, I can't believe the way it's able to move so quickly and dramatically. When you look at his showdown with Zelenskyy in the Oval Office last Friday, and substantively before his address to Congress, Zelenskyy issues a statement. It looks like the mineral deal with the United States will be closing. When you look at what he's been able to do in the Middle East, in terms of he has really put the screws back on Iran while looking at a diplomatic track with Russia and vis-a-vis Hamas and Israel. Obviously, we don't know what the developments will be there in terms of Israel re-engaging a kinetic activity within Gaza. But we have seen that dramatic, I think, improvements, and you don't have to believe me, the American people voted for this, have been happening.
All right, Sam, I mean, you raised lots of points there. We were just speaking to Mick Mulvaney, a former chief of staff to President Trump, before we crossed to you. Asked him for a scorecard. He gave President Trump a B+, I think, said it was a bit on the long side and a little light on foreign policy. Do you concur, or would you be a bit more generous?
Well, I'm a speechwriter, and I work in politics. And before I give you my grade, which is an A-, you have to see that he had personal, he had policy, he had political, and then he ended it with a theme. And that was quite clear. Plus, you know, this goes into Donald Trump's personality and the way he's able to present. And the fact that he was going back and forth with the Democrats was something that was unique, that hasn't been seen, and certainly wasn't seen in the previous 4 addresses to Congress under Joe Biden. So I thought that this was one of the best speeches I've seen. His speech writers are excellent. You could tell from the draft that he received what he then put input. And also when you look at the presentation in terms of picking out particular instances across America, I mean, he admitted a cadet into West Point whose father was murdered. You obviously had that a boy who's unfortunately suffering from cancer that he had the Secret Service make him an honorary member, and then he held almost a live vigil for a victim, a woman who was murdered by an illegal immigrant. Now, in terms of foreign policy, I'll disagree with Mick Mulvaney. The number one issue within the United States right now is obviously Russia and Ukraine coming to some kind of resolution in this and U.S. involvement. And he's obviously reversing course from Biden. And that's really the top policy point that's in the American psyche. I would also say you have to look at all public polling. I have not seen anything private, but you have to look at all public polling. And I can assure you that CNN, for instance, wasn't happy putting up that 75% of Americans agreed with policy points that he brought up and also approved of the speech.
Yeah, one of the polls that I saw, which is not directly related to the speech, but you'll see the connection. It's a Reuters Ipsos poll, and it said that 70% of Americans, and 2/3 of them Republican, say that Russia is more to blame for the Ukraine war than Ukraine is. After all, Ukraine was invaded. It didn't invade itself.
They were.
Do you think perhaps, there is a feeling, therefore, that President Trump, and you say that it looks like, and I think President Trump himself said it looks like the minerals deal will now go ahead. Fences have been mended. But do you think he has to perhaps go a little easy on Ukraine? Because he's been pretty tough on President Zelenskyy.
I do. In our last interview, you asked me why is he saying stronger comments against Zelenskyy, and I explained that he's trying to show that he holds the cards here and that he can get a deal on the table for the Russians and negotiate with them. The one thing I would say, though, too, is for Americans, I think Vladimir Putin is the least popular, most hated foreign adversary of the United States right now. And the key is for the Trump administration and President Trump to be able to explain that he's not going to be in the business of criticizing Vladimir Putin, which, by the way, he's never done. But Marco Rubio, for instance, the Secretary of State, has called him a thug and a gangster, that he can't do that right now while he's trying to negotiate and mediate. But yes, that is an issue. That is a thorny issue that you bring up, where there really is a fine line politically for him to do. He cannot be seen as being pro-Putin. He cannot be seen as being pro-Putin. So he should be saying more publicly, that we're negotiating from a point of strength, but he will verify. He will, trust but verify, and things along those lines. But yes, I would agree with you that this could be a problem for him. It could be problematic going forward.
All right, Sam, just lastly, and we'll have to be quite brief.
Yes, sir.
One of the descriptions I've been given of the Trump administration, I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is that President Trump and his team are a team of disruptors. This is what the country needs, a full audit and some spring cleaning, perhaps a deep clean. Is that roughly how you see things?
Look, disruption, that's a term that's used in finance. That's a term particularly used in tech finance, obviously. It's the term being used with AI. What I would say is that what they have to be able to continue to communicate to the American people is that this is about waste, fraud, and abuse, and point out examples within that. And I do think that DOGE itself, I support it, but we need to be they should be a little more careful in terms of when they're presenting certain findings, that they have to make sure that they are completely accurate. But I would tell you that, for instance, the American people do support cutting USAID and reforming it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Great speaking to you once again, Sam Nunberg.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Well, in that address to Congress, President Trump said he had received a letter from the Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, saying that he is ready to begin peace negotiations as soon as possible. Well, President Trump read aloud from that letter, which was along similar lines to a message that President Zelenskyy had posted on X earlier on in the day. Well, President Trump signaled that Russia is also ready for dialogue.
I received an important letter from President Zelenskyy of Ukraine. The letter reads, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians, he said. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. We do really value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence. Regarding the agreement on minerals and security, Ukraine is ready to sign it at any time that is convenient for you. I appreciate that he sent this letter, just got it a little while ago.
Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Greg Swenson, chair of the Republicans Overseas, who joins us from the United Kingdom. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, Greg. We're just hearing an excerpt from that letter sent by President Zelenskyy saying that Ukraine's ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer, it read. Does that mean the damage and the bad blood between President Zelenskyy and Trump is water under the bridge?
Tom, that's a good way to put it. I think it really is. And, there were some mistakes made on Friday. I think it was, missteps by President Zelenskyy and surely a missed opportunity. But 3 days later, he came back to the table, which is a good sign. I think that's I think it's good for both Ukraine and for the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainian president said it was, quote, regrettable what happened in the Oval Office. Does that sound to you like an apology or a sort of a veiled apology?
No, I think it's an apology, and it doesn't really matter too much, what the specific language is. It's more, what's the outcome here, and that's what's most important to President Trump, and I think that's what's most important to the people in Ukraine. And so, yeah, Friday could have been a real failure long term if he didn't come back to the table, or if for some reason they weren't able to get over the hump. But it looks like they both have.
Yeah, I mean, if we have time, we'll talk a bit more about what happened on Friday and
Sure.
sort of who's to blame. But let's sort of look forwards and see what happens next. I mean, Ukraine saying it's ready to sign that minerals deal.
Yep.
I mean, is your understanding that the deal does provide security guarantees for Ukraine?
I think it implies that, Tom. I don't think they're going to put it in writing, and I think that was a bit of the dispute on Friday when Zelenskyy tried to sort of renegotiate or relitigate the agreement in front of the media, and I think that would be a mistake. But I do think that there's implications in there. I mean, this gives the U.S. a real stake in Ukraine. And it's a partnership, too. It's not like the U.S. is going in and stealing all their resources. It's a 50-50 partnership. You'll have significant capital, American capital, coming into Ukraine. And also, the output ultimately, which will take a long time because it's minerals, but the output will be a 50-50 joint venture to reinvest into Ukraine. So I think it's a win-win for both countries.
In terms of military aid to Ukraine, obviously it was cut off on Monday. Now that the fences appear to have been mended to a certain extent, I mean, can we expect that aid to resume?
Yeah, I think so, Tom. And in the ultimate conclusion or the ultimate outcome would be that we won't need to be providing aid, military aid, if there is peace, if there is a ceasefire and it's a sustainable one. And so, but yeah, I don't imagine the president wants to really cut off completely. It was a pause. It was not a permanent withdrawal. And I do think that it takes a while for any of that to sort of settle in. And, in fact, the Ukrainians could continue fighting as they have been for months before any sort of pause in military support would take effect. But I don't think, I would hope anyway, that that's not necessary.
Do you think it was right to pause aid on Monday? I mean, isn't that going a bit far? Or do you think the desired effect was, shot across the bows and get President Zelenskyy to fall back into line?
Yeah, I think it was the latter, Tom. And look, the president's all about outcomes. How he gets there is always different than presidents past, both Republican and Democrat. I think he's got a different way of doing things. He likes to throw a grenade in the room once in a while. He's provocative, but that's refreshing. That's one of the reasons he won the election in November, and he doesn't really do things the way that traditional politicians behave. And so, look, I think however he does it, he's all about the outcome. And so it worked, and it actually worked faster than many of us expected. And, not quite as fast as the president of Colombia changing his mind in 30 minutes, but still, 72 hours and perhaps Monday, and that pausing in aid, maybe that inspired Zelenskyy to write that letter or to come around. But, either way, the outcome is what's important.
It is, and I was going to ask you whether this Trump approach had served as a useful catalyst to diplomacy, and you've answered that question. But in the process, quite a number of America's trusted allies have really been given a case of the jitters. Well, we're going to hear from the French president this evening, for example. Europeans holding summits of their own, wondering what the state of their alliance and the state of relations is with Washington. Is this really the best way to go about things?
Look, again, the method doesn't really matter. I think it's the outcomes. And if you look at the way President Trump has been speaking to the Europeans for 8 years now, he's always been really transparent and delivering. Sometimes it's news or comments that are a little uncomfortable, telling the Germans that they're way too dependent on Russian oil and gas. Well, he turned out to be quite right about that. And we saw the crisis that they went through in 2022. And they started burning coal again. They started building nuclear plants again. Trump was right about that. It's uncomfortable, but I think it's important that it's done. And I think the fact that the Europeans might finally get together and start providing for their own defense and security is a really good thing. It's good not only for America because it's more fair and balanced in terms of what we provide versus what they provide, but it's also better for the Europeans. So again, some feelings might be hurt along the way, but you saw Macron in the Oval Office last Monday. You saw the Prime Minister here in the UK, Keir Starmer, in the Oval Office on Thursday. Those were really great diplomatic moments. The president can be diplomatic in the old-fashioned way, and I think he was. But there's times where he'll be disruptive, and he's disruptive. His disruptiveness is what actually creates the outcomes. I think this could be a great outcome if the Europeans actually deliver on defense and security commitments.
Sure. I think everyone wants, peace in Ukraine. There are very few people who'll say it would be a great thing if the war carried on. But I think what a lot of people in Europe are worried about is that if the wrong deal is struck, because it's struck in haste, anyone will tell you who's negotiated a deal. You don't do important deals in a hurry and we're only 44 days into this new Trump administration. Isn't there a sense that perhaps, one thing at a time, and on this particular issue, perhaps, more haste, less speed? Yeah,
no, it's a great point, Tom. And look, nobody knows what the outcome is going to be here. We don't know the details of any sort of peace agreement or ceasefire. But what's important is there is urgency, right? Because every day soldiers are dying and civilians are dying. So I think there's some real urgency there. I'm not suggesting that it will be perfect. I hope it happens quickly, but I hope it happens effectively as well. So it's a great point, and this is a new way of doing business in many ways. The way that this administration has come in, guns blazing or hit the ground running on January 21st. It's been an incredible 2 months. So if some things happen too quickly, and there's some scar tissue or some collateral damage along the way, unfortunately, that's a risk. But I think, the break things and be different, attitude, or break things and move quickly, that's working so far. And that's why his approval ratings are amazing, specifically on the things that he's doing so far.
Sure. We're hearing from the US-based Institute for the Study of War saying that Russia's advance has slowed slightly in February. That's probably significant, isn't it, as far as the negotiations are concerned, because it will give Kyiv, presumably, just a little bit more bargaining power.
Yeah, look, you always, obviously in any negotiation, you want to have the strength. You want to be in the more powerful position. So yeah, some good outcomes from Ukraine would be great, but that I don't think that's a reason to wait too long. I mean, in a perfect world, yes, there'd be some Ukrainian gains, and there'd be a sense of power over Putin in the negotiations. But who knows? I couldn't tell you what to expect next week or the week after in terms of battlefield gains or losses, and why would we want to risk the lives of Ukrainian soldiers in the meantime? So I think there's got to be some effort. I'm glad that the Russian advance has slowed down. All the more reason to stop this before they're able to get better organized and make bigger gains.
Sure, and in terms of the diplomacy between the Russians and the Ukrainians, I mean, it's not being ruled out that we'll see a Zelenskyy-Putin face-to-face meet. That's I'd like to get your thoughts on that. One of the noises we heard out of Moscow today, the former president Dmitry Medvedev saying that Russia's main task, quote, remains to inflict maximum defeat on Ukraine. I mean, that doesn't sound too conciliatory, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think there's reasons why there are times where you really don't want the two leaders to be in the same room. I'm not suggesting that this is one of them, but it's always a risk. And, at the end of the Korean War, the South Koreans were not involved in that negotiation at all. The leader of a country that's going to make concessions that will make him unpopular, especially with certain segments of their society, that's going to be difficult. So I wouldn't suggest that the face-to-face meeting is absolutely mandatory. It might be better to have sort of negotiations done by a third party, but we'll see. And I think again the urgency here is to stop the killing.
And just to wrap up, looking back at these 7 days of major events with regards to the diplomacy surrounding this war, do you think Friday will go down in history as having been a significant event, or do you think it's just a blip in an otherwise more important, larger relationship?
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me Saturday, Tom, I would have said it was a significant moment and it was a complete debacle. But I think in the days following, we've learned a few things. One is that as you heard from the president last night, Zelenskyy came around and things are much more calm. He expressed regret about what happened. The other thing that we've learned is Friday morning, the Democrats hosted a breakfast at the Hay Adams Hotel, right across the street from the White House, just before President Zelenskyy went to see President Trump. And they really tried to talk him into rejecting the deal, rejecting the minerals deal, and being a little bit more, negative with President Trump. And that really, it looks like that really had an effect on him. So that was a big mistake. So in retrospect, we can't really blame everything on President Zelenskyy. I think, Senator Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut, has a lot to answer for, given that he was bragging about on Twitter, he was literally bragging about convincing Zelenskyy to reject the deal. And look what happened. So I'm glad it's settled. I think now that we've got a much more cooperative arrangement between President Zelenskyy and President Trump, kissed and made up, basically. I think it's a good thing. So Friday will be a bit more of a blip than anything else.
I said that was the last question. It wasn't, in fact. I've been given one more question to ask you. That was my last question about Ukraine. I wanted to ask you about last night's address to Congress by President Trump. 100 minutes of it. We were talking about it earlier with some other guests. Just want to get your reaction to the fact that the Democrats, some of them got up, walked out. Not much clapping either from the Democrats there in the House of Representatives. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. The Democrats have hit an all-time low in the polling. They're polling in the low 30s. I don't think they can get much worse, although they tried their best last night. It's really sad to see. And I don't think that sort of rejection will work. 76% of the viewers approved of President Trump's speech, only 23 disapproved. And it was a roughly 50-50 audience, 51% Republican, 27% independent, and 20% Democrat. So, the Republicans were only half the audience, and yet it got 76% approval. 68% of the viewers said it was hopeful. 74% said he looked presidential. The Democrats are looking really pathetic right now. And I don't think that strategy is going to work. It surely hasn't so far.
Okay, well, this really is the end. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Greg Swenson, always a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Good to see you.
Now, what does the future hold for Gaza? Well, the US President Donald Trump has proposed one plan, whilst Arab nations have another. Well, President Trump is proposing that the US take control of Gaza and transform it into what he described as the riviera of the Middle East. But regional leaders gathered in Cairo, Egypt, have reservations because Trump's plan entails the expulsion of 2.3 million people from the Gaza Strip, a move that's been met by fierce opposition from Arab leaders, including Saudi Arabia's foreign minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan.
We in the kingdom categorically reject any infringement of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, whether through settlement policies, annexation of Palestinian lands, or attempts to dispel Palestinians from their lands. We also stress the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination on their land and to establish their independent state on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital.
Well, at that summit in Cairo, Arab leaders endorsed Egypt's reconstruction plan for Gaza, which would cost $53 billion US. And importantly, it avoids displacing any Palestinians from the enclave. Well, that stands in stark contrast, as we've been saying, to President Trump's vision of turning Gaza into a Middle Eastern riviera. However, the White House has dismissed the Arab proposal, saying it doesn't address the realities on the ground in Gaza, and it reaffirmed President Trump's commitment to his own plan. Well, other key questions about Gaza's future include who will govern the enclave. Well, under the Egyptian plan, a committee consisting of independent Palestinian technocrats and non-partisan figures would be formed under the Palestinian Authority to manage the territory for a transitional period of 6 months. Let's listen in now to what the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi had to say.
Egypt, in cooperation with its brothers in Palestine, worked to form an administrative committee of independent Palestinian professionals and technocrats, entrusted with managing the Gaza Strip based on the expertise of its members. This committee would be responsible for overseeing the relief process and managing the affairs of the Gaza Strip for an interim period, in preparation for the return of the Palestinian Authority to the Gaza Strip.
Well, for more analysis, we can cross to Cairo now and speak to Ambassador Hesham Youssef, who is a former Egyptian diplomat and former spokesperson and chief of staff to the Arab League Secretary General Moussa. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Let me just ask you first of all about this Egyptian reconstruction plan for Gaza. Lots of pages, 112 pages of that plan. It was unveiled on Tuesday, and it means that no Palestinians will be displaced from the enclave. Tell us, can this plan work?
Well, Egypt has been involved in aspects pertaining to the reconstruction of Gaza for several decades. And in the last years, there were a number of wars, and Egypt contributed and participated in reconstruction. Of course, we're talking about a totally different magnitude, but it is not, rocket science. Issues of reconstruction have been dealt with around the world since World War II and before. And what the Arab side, led by Egypt in relation to the plan, have concluded that this is a plan that can be adopted. And it was not done only by Egypt. It was done by Egypt in cooperation with the Palestinians, as well as the UNDP, the World Bank, and other Arab countries. So, and it takes into consideration all kinds of aspects pertaining to the experience in UNDP and the World Bank and Egypt and other countries that wanted to contribute to this process. And it will be discussed with others, donors, international community, and so on. And we hope that this would work. This is the whole objective.
Okay, and the $53 billion price tag, I mean, where is that money going to come from specifically?
Well, this is a problem because it is not only related to money, because the vast majority of donors have indicated without any shred of doubt that they will not be willing to pay for reconstruction or early recovery, and that all their money would be destroyed in a few years. So this is a requirement by donors, and they are justified because they have seen their money being destroyed time and again in Gaza. So now the question is, will the international community be able to put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a track to a resolution in order for countries to be forthcoming? Because as you well know, that the situation in Gaza and the situation in as far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is concerned is a major issue, not only regionally, but also globally. And the world is ready to help, but they have requirements and they are justified in the requirements that they have.
Yeah, I mean, the White House has said that Washington does not approve this plan. They say it doesn't address Gaza's reality. And they're standing by President Trump's Middle East Riviera vision for Gaza. I mean, which one of these very different propositions do you see as being more likely to materialize?
Well, I think the whole world had difficulties with the idea of mass expulsion from Gaza. And there hasn't been any explanation as to why this is necessary. Yes, the situation is devastating. Yes, Gaza is like a demolition area and so on. But this doesn't mean that the Palestinians cannot rebuild their own land. So the question is, where did this happen before, that you had to depopulate an area in order to achieve reconstruction? And then the United States is arguing that, well, the situation in Gaza is inhumane and we need to move the Palestinians. So is the West Bank humane with what's happening in the West Bank? So the situation, in as far as a situation is inhumane, it is inhumane in Gaza, it is inhumane in the West Bank, and the solution is to try to advance peace rather than think of ideas as if this is a real estate deal that needs to be implemented without answering all kinds of questions in relation to who will do the reconstruction if you ask all the Palestinians to leave. What would be the legal status of the area? Who will decide on the plans? There are hundreds of questions as to what this would entail. But people are objecting to the principle because they think that this is something that contradicts international law, and therefore are not willing to discuss even the details because as far as the vast majority of countries in the world are concerned, this is something that is in violation of international law, and they're not willing to entertain the idea. So I haven't seen any support coming from any country publicly saying we think that this is a good idea, other than the support that it is getting from Israel.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. We're going to have to leave it there. Ambassador Hesham Youssef, thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.